Welcome to lesson number 28, where we are exploring LDS history together in a way that I hope every week is respectful and loving and honest. And as always, I just want to mention that I'm doing the very best I can to find the balance in here and in this class every week between being truthful but at the same time being gracious and loving in doing so. If you're LDS and watching these videos, I want you to know our intent is not to be attacking you. The intent is not to be mean-spirited. My intent in these classes is always to be loving. We want you to know that we love you and would love to talk to you further. But we are talking about very important matters, and truth does matter. And we're just trying to, in this class, without really having a doctrinal axe to grind, just look at what the history of the church is and what we can learn about what truth is as we look at the founding of the LDS Church. And so thank you for joining us this morning. We left off last week in 1838, where by the middle of the year, Smith had returned to Missouri. All of the saints from Kirtland had followed him to Missouri. It was a year of tremendous growth for the church in Missouri, where new converts were coming in from all over the country and even starting to come in now from Europe. And so a year where the church exploded in growth. And you might recall that the residents of Clay County had asked the Mormons to leave, and the state legislature had appointed Caldwell County as a Mormon refuge. We'll give you this whole county, right? You can have Caldwell County and all of this land. But Smith wasn't content to stay there, so throughout the year they had spread out into surrounding counties, and Daviess County to the north, and Carroll County to the west, and Ray County to the south. And so by the middle of the year, they've had this tremendous growth where Smith was firmly in control. Sidney Rigdon was his right-hand man in running things. We talked about the formation of the Danites that were initially formed because they had this issue they wrestled with throughout the year with the dissenters and the people who had left the church over the Kirtland banking scandal. And so most of those dissenters had been dealt with and they'd been driven away. And there was an uneasy peace between the Mormons and the old settlers and the Missourians who were not Mormon. That's not to say that there wasn't a lot of tension. There was. But things were pretty much peaceful between the Missourians and the Mormons. There'd been no real conflict. All the conflict had been between Mormons and other Mormons, right? They had had this big church split and this big fight over everything that had gone down in Kirtland. But as far as the Mormons and everybody else in Missouri, it had been a pretty good year and things had been pretty quiet. Most of the Missourians seemed content to try to pursue a peaceful coexistence with the Mormons as much as they could. There hadn't been any mobs formed, no complaints, nothing like that. But underneath it all, there was still a lot of tension. And all of that kind of came to a head. There was one moment on July 4th, 1838, that kind of pushed things over the tipping point. And of all things, it was a parade that led to the War of 1838. Well, it was a little more than a parade. But on July 4th, 1838, Smith wanted to have a ceremony to lay the cornerstone and foundation of the new temple that he planned to build in Far West. And while I'm thinking about it, I need to throw this in right now. I need to make a correction from last week. When last week I said Far West, Missouri was named after, or Far West, Utah took its name from Far West, Missouri, which is true and not true. So it's where I was mistaken in that, and you might notice we spell Far West here F-A-R-R, because it's named after Lauren Farr and another saint whose last name was, I can't remember his first name, but his last name was West, right? So it was named after those two to honor them, but also to pay homage to Far West, Missouri. And so I just need to correct myself a little bit there. So anyway, they were planning, Smith wanted to build a new temple in Far West, and but he wanted to do it in grand style. They didn't get to have much of a ceremony with the Kirtland temple, and he wanted to have a grand ceremony. And so on July 4th of 1838, they had that ceremony and also 4th of July parade and festivities just like we do today, except he wanted to do this in grand style. And so thousands of Mormons came to Far West for this ceremony. And they didn't just come, they all marched in to Far West. And they marched in military formation. And it was very much a display of Mormon might and Mormon numbers for everybody else to take notice of. And Sidney Rigdon was chosen as the speaker, and he chose as his theme for the day, "Better, far better to sleep with the dead than be oppressed among the living." And his speech, most of which was, typical 4th of July kind of stuff, mildly patriotic kind of stuff, wasn't bad until he got to the end of his speech. And this was what became the tipping point for the Missourians. It's lengthy, but I think this was such an incendiary moment that I think it's worth reading all of this whole section. So bear with me. But here's what he said towards the end of his message that day. "Our cheeks have been given to the smiters, and our heads to those who have plucked off the hair. We have not only when smitten on one cheek turned the other, but we have done it again and again until we are wearied of being smitten and tired of being trampled upon. We've proved the world with kindness. We've suffered their abuse without cause, with patience, and have endured without resentment until this day. And still their persecutions and violence does not cease. But from this day and this hour, we will suffer it no more. We take God and all the holy angels to witness this day that we warn all men in the name of Jesus Christ to come on us no more forever. For from this hour we will bear it no more. Our rights shall no more be trampled on with impunity. The man or the set of men who attempts it does it at the expense of their lives. And that mob that comes on us to disturb us, it shall be between us and them a war of extermination. For we will follow them till the last drop of their blood is spilled, or else they will have to exterminate us. For we will carry the seed of war to their own houses and their own families, and one party or the other shall be utterly destroyed." Them's fighting words, right? That's the line in the sand. We're not taking it anymore. And anybody who messes with us, it's you mess with us or else. I won't take the time to read all of that last paragraph, but he goes on in the same lane saying, we're not taking it anymore. We're not taking lawsuits anymore. We're not going to let anybody cheat us of our rights anymore. We this day proclaim ourselves free, with a purpose and a determination that can never be broken. No, never, no, never, no, never. And that inflammatory speech, which was printed shortly thereafter as a pamphlet and distributed and was run in LDS publications, and word got out. And there were a lot of Gentiles in the crowd that day that heard this speech that had come for just the celebration. This is what pushed the Missourians over the edge and led to the Mormon-Missouri Civil War of 1838. There's a lot of debate today. If you read a lot of LDS sources today, they will say it's all Rigdon's fault, right? They all recognize that this is what led to the war, that it was this speech, but they want to distance Joseph Smith from it, right? It was all Rigdon's mistake that did this, and that's not really the case. Smith had approved of the message beforehand. He certainly knew what Rigdon was going to say, and he had signed off on it. B.H. Roberts, an LDS historian, one of the most respected LDS historians in their history, he acknowledges this when he says, "Our leaders, we all recognize that it was Rigdon's speech that led to the war. But they have said he's generally responsible for it. This is not true. The speech was carefully prepared and read by the other presiding elders of the church before its delivery. It immediately appeared in the Far West, a weekly newspaper, and was also published on the press of the Elders' Journal. Joseph Smith in his journal speaks of it approvingly, and in the Elders' Journal, of which he was the editor, and in the editorial columns under his name, the speech is approvingly recommended to the saints. So Smith was certainly aware, and he approved of the speech. Obviously, I don't think he or Rigdon were aware of what would happen as a result of the speech and the powder keg that it would set off in the community. The way this was perceived in the minds of the public at large was that the Mormons were saying, we are independent now of the rule of law. We are going to do whatever in the world we want to do, and nobody can tell us what to do. And that didn't settle well. So in August of that year, a couple months later, the citizens of Carroll County, which you might remember, the Mormons had moved into DeWitt last week and bought up about half of the lots in the town. In the elections in August, the citizens of Carroll County voted to ask the Mormons to leave. And that citizens committee went to the leadership in DeWitt and said, we'd like you guys to go. And the Mormons kindly and firmly said, no, I don't think we're going to. And George Hinkle even threatened the committee that came. So not long after that, about 100 non-Mormons rode through town, shooting up the place and threatening and intimidating the Mormons. Nobody was hurt in that. So in turn, that prompted even more Mormons to move to the area. There were 200 new converts that had just arrived from Canada. Smith sent them all to settle into DeWitt to increase their numbers there. So you just have all of this tension that's just mounting and mounting and mounting in this time period. In Davies County, just north of Caldwell, where we talked about last week, the Mormons had gone up and settled Adam Andi Aman up there. By the time Election Day came around in Davies County, the Mormons had the number of people to have the votes to swing the election their way. And they knew it, and the other residents of Davies County knew it. So there was a lot of talk in Davies County about denying Mormons the vote. And so again, in all of this, there's politics, right? And politics has always been ugly. There's politics involved. They knew they didn't have the numbers and that the Mormons were going to carry all of the positions in the county. So when Election Day rolled around, there was a lot of tension. So when the polls opened in Gallatin, in Davies County, there was about 30 Mormons in town that day and about 100 Missourians who were standing around waiting for the polls to open. William Penniston, who was a candidate for a position on the ballot and had tried to get the Mormon vote and failed. This is the most politician thing ever, right? He had courted the Mormon vote and failed, so now he shows up that day to run down the Mormons, right? So he runs around saying the Mormons are nothing but a bunch of horse thieves and liars and counterfeiters. And is this a politician thing or what? So he tried to get their vote and couldn't, so he calls for a suspension of Mormon rights to vote and offered to buy everybody a drink, right? So he's still trying to get votes. And a lot of people succeed in getting drunk. One man named Dick Weldon got sufficiently liquored up that he started harassing a Mormon named Samuel Brown as he approached the polls, a man much smaller than him because you never pick on somebody your own size. He starts harassing Samuel Brown and cursing Joseph Smith and says Davies counties don't allow Mormons to vote no more than niggers. And that was kind of the attitude that a lot of them had toward the Mormons. Eventually, Weldon struck Brown and he hit him. And as soon as he hit him, several Mormons jump in to defend him, which caused several more Missourians to jump up and get into it. And before you know it, you just got a brawl going on. And a Mormon there by the name of John Butler that day, who was a very big man, he would go on to become later, he'd become a part of Joseph Smith's personal bodyguard when they get to Nauvoo. He gave the Danite call of distress and said, oh yes, you Danite, here is a job for us. And so a bunch of them jump in, and then a bunch more Missourians jump in, and before you know it, it's just a melee. going on in the streets of Gallatin. Here's what Butler said about it later. He said, "I went to where the affray was and saw they had attacked the brethren with sticks and clapboards and anything they could use to fight with. They were all in a muss together, every one of the Missourians trying to get a lick at a Mormon. It made me feel indignant to see from 4 to a dozen mobbers on a man and all damning them and damning the Mormons. I turned around and ran a few steps to get a stick, and as soon as I found one suitable, though rather large, it was the piece of the heart of an oak I thought I could handle with ease and convenience. And the Lord did strengthen my body far beyond the common strength of man, so much that the enemy couldn't stand before me. It was the power of God that was with me to my own astonishment. I really felt that they would soon embrace the gospel," as he's beating him. And he really thought, right? This is for their good, right? I really felt they would soon embrace the gospel and felt the Spirit to rest upon me with power. I felt like I was 7 or 8 feet high and my arms 3 or 4 feet long, for I certainly ran faster than I ever did before, and I could reach further and hit a man, and they couldn't reach me to harm me. John D. Lee, who you might recognize the name if you know Mormon history, he would become very significant for another event later in a few decades after they get to Utah. But he was also a part of this fight this day. He said, "I was a stranger to all who were engaged in the affray, but I had seen the sign, the Danite sign. I had seen the sign, and like Samson when against the pillar, I felt the power of God nerve my arm for the fray." So they have this big knockdown drag out in the middle of the streets in Gallatin. Amazingly, nobody's killed. There were several people who were seriously injured, and everybody went home nursing wounds, but nobody died. One witness said later, "I'd seen many knockdowns in my time, but none on so grand a scale." But essentially, this is what shattered the fragile peace that had been there, right? This is what pushed it to the tipping point. And immediately accounts on both sides. What do you do when you go home and you tell about a fight after? You exaggerate your side of the fight, right? And so all the Missourians went back and exaggerated, and it's all the Mormons' fault, right? And there was 1,000 of them and 20, right? And you got all that, and the same on the Mormon side. Joseph Smith wrote in his journal after he got word of it, that quite a number of the Missourians were badly wounded, some with their skulls cracked, and reported about 150 Missourians fought against from 6 to 12 of our brothers, right? That's just not accurate. The Mormons were vastly outnumbered, but it wasn't 150 to 12, right? And so you get some of these exaggerations going on. So the Mormons are incensed. They've been attacked without provocation. They weren't trying to start a fight. They weren't doing anything wrong. They were exercising their right to vote, right? And so they were obviously incensed by this. So Samson Avard, who was one of the lead officers in the Danites, he called out the Mormon troops in far west, and Rigdon spurred them on along the same line as what he said in his speech. Rigdon said, "Now we as the people of God do declare and decree by the great Jehovah, the eternal and omnipotent God, that sits upon his vast and everlasting throne, beyond that ethereal blue, we will bathe our swords in the vital blood of the Missourians, or die in the attempt." So they rally about 100 men in far west, and they set off for Daviess County to Adam-and-Ammon, where he gets there, and Smith learns that the accounts that he had received from Gallatin had been extremely exaggerated. So before he returns, they stop with his men at the cabin of Justice of the Peace Adam Black, and they demand that he sign an agreement of peace. And they harass him, and after some argument, Black wrote out a statement promising he would support the Constitution. Except for, and his story changed, and there's some uncertainty here on how much threatening was done on the part of the Mormons here, and how much is West exaggerating after the fact. But this is his sworn affidavit that he made later. He said, "Know all men by this, that I, Adam Black, of the county aforesaid, and acting justice thereof, do hereby certify, I have this day been attacked, and my house surrounded by a body of 100 armed men called Mormons. My life threatened. I was forced to subscribe to an article which I refused to do so until instant death was threatened me." So it wasn't just an argument. He's saying they threatened to kill me if I didn't sign. "I further certify that the said body of men threatened the lives of several individuals of this county. The above named body of men surrounded my house with guns, swords, and pistols, and amounted to about 120. Believing this a violation of our laws, the commander of the militia of this county is hereby required to call out the militia to disperse said body and maintain the supremacy of law. The above body of armed men are commanded by Joseph Smith Jr. and Lyman White, who was a member of the 12 and the leader of the community in Daviess County." All right, so that statement makes its way to Circuit Judge Austin King, who hated Mormons and had hated them ever since his brother had been killed in mob attack back when the Mormons were in Jackson County. So it didn't take much pushing to get him. So he immediately issued an arrest warrant for Smith, which Smith refused to comply with, because he knew if I go stand trial in Gallatin, I'm going to be lynched for sure. So he's like, I ain't going. And so just like it would happen today, lawyers and people get involved. Governor Boggs ends up ordering militia to go and execute the warrant. And fortunately for Smith, their buddy, his lawyers, and State Representative Donovan, who was a great friend to the Mormons, they get involved and they get the trial moved from Gallatin to a little town just inside of the Daviess County line from Caldwell County, which was the Mormon county. And so they get the trial relocated there, and on the day of the trial, Smith had all of his troops line up right on the county line in Caldwell County, right? And so there was a show of force on Smith's part, but he knew with them there, they're not going to lynch me, right? So he showed up for trial, and they end up bounding him over on a $500 bond with the order to keep the peace. So crisis averted in that instance. Meanwhile, in Caldwell County, a gang of about 15 Missourians drove a man named Asahel Lathrop from his home and held his wife and sick child and 2 other children as hostages in his house. They held them there for about a week and abused them during that week. During that week, the sick child died, and the Missourians buried him. And Lathrop's wife and other 2 children were eventually rescued by the Mormons, but they died afterward due to a lack of medical care. And so things are just starting to unravel, and there's all this tension through August and September. So on October 14th, Smith called every able-bodied man, and by this point in time, there are people coming into, it's kind of the fallback is far west in Caldwell County, right? So that when they're harassed in these other counties, everybody's falling back to far west. He calls every able-bodied man together in far west, and he gave them this address on October 14th. And again, this is lengthy, but it shows the mindset at the time. Smith said, "We're an injured people. From county to county, we've been driven by unscrupulous mobs eager to seize the land we have cleared and improved with such love and toil. We have appealed to magistrates, judges, the governor, and even the President of the United States, but there's been no redress for us. The latest reply of Boggs to our petitions is to tell us to fight our own battles." And that's essentially true. Boggs was the governor of Missouri, and he hadn't wanted to get in the middle of this. He's in Jefferson City on the other side of the state, right? And that, brethren, Smith said, is exactly what we intend to do. Some of the brethren aren't here today. Some of those that Brother Sidney likes to call, "oh, don't men." So he's talking about the Mormons who are saying, "oh, don't, let's not fight," right? We don't want to fight, right? We don't want a war on our hands. Rigdon had called those, "oh, don't men." Some of those "oh, don't men" aren't here. In time of war, we have no need for such. A man must declare himself friend or enemy. I move a resolution that the property of all O-don't men be taken over to maintain the war. He's talking about his own people there, right? He's talking about other Mormons who aren't on board. At which point Rigdon piped up and said, and I move that the blood of the backward, these O-don't men, be spilled in the streets of Far West. Again, they're talking about their own people. And so Smith jumps back in to try to, well, that's a little far, Rigdon. Smith said, no, I move a better resolution. He tries to make a joke of it. We'll take them along with us to Daviess County. And if it comes to battle, we'll sit them on their horses with bayonets and pitchforks and make them ride in front. That's better, but not much better. But everybody kind of laughed, right? If the people will let us alone, we will preach the gospel in peace. But if they come on us to molest us, we will establish our religion by the sword. We will trample down our enemies and make it one gore of blood from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean. I will be to this generation a second Muhammad, whose motto in treating for peace was the Al-Quran or the sword. Al-Quran's the Quran. So shall it eventually be with us, Joseph Smith or the sword. So again, them's fighting words. So about 100 armed men went out from Caldwell County up into Daviess County, where they joined up with 250 men under the command of Lyman White, and then they proceeded to plunder Daviess County. Lyman White said, who again, he was an apostle, but he was over the Mormon forces in Daviess County. He said, the sword has now been drawn and shall not be sheathed until we have won back everything the mobs have wrenched from us. Our cause is just. The Lord is on our side, and it makes no difference if our enemies number 50 or 50,000. So they marched into Gallatin. Most of the city fled in front of this force of about 350 people, where they proceeded to plunder Gallatin of all of its merchandise and all of its livestock. And they also burned and looted other towns of Millport and Grindstone Fork. They rounded up every horse and cow and hog they could find and looted those towns and brought it all back to Far West. And other raiding parties searched the county. They torched non-Mormon homes and burned people out. And not all Mormons. So one of the don't men, what did I just call it? What are they called? O-don't men. One of the O-don't men was one of the 12 apostles, Thomas Marsh, who was horrified by these actions. He drew up formal charges against the leadership of the saints, and they eventually just excommunicated him as an apostate. But he said, and I find these kind of correspondences particularly telling because it's private correspondence, right? If you're writing an official account or something, you might be tempted to embellish more. This is just a letter that he wrote to his family, who I would assume he didn't expect anybody but his brother and sister to ever read. Writing to them, he said, the disposition manifested by Joseph Smith and Signe Rigdon to pillage, rob, plunder, assassinate, and murder was never equaled in my estimation, unless by some desperate bandit. Well, this was the last straw for Marsh and for others. And a lot of the other saints in Far West who had had enough started sneaking out of town in the middle of the night. So the O-don't men are trying to get out of Dodge. And Rigdon was having none of it. He said, the last man has run away from Far West that is going to. Again, he's talking about his own people. The man who starts shall be pursued and brought back dead or alive. I move a resolution that if any man attempts to move out of this county or even packs his things for that purpose, that any man in his house who sees it shall, without saying anything to any other person, kill him and haul him aside into the brush. And all of the burial he shall have will be a turkey buzzard's guts, and nothing will be left of him but his bones. So there's some dissension going on within the ranks as well, obviously. So the response to the Mormon pillaging of Daviess County was swift. And to be fair, there'd also been some things going on by the Missourians in this same time, in pillaging and plundering, fighting. But in response to Daviess County, it was swift. Livingston County to the east immediately began to mobilize their own militia. 200 Missourians marched around through Clinton and Daviess County, driving Mormon settlers from their homes and burning and pillaging, burning out the Mormons, who would again, they would all fall back to far west. In Carroll County, where there had been all this tension around the town of DeWitt and where Smith had sent other peoples to kind of reinforce their numbers, Missourians laid siege to DeWitt and essentially tried to starve the people out. And any men who were captured out in the woods trying to forage for food, just enough to feed their families, they were beaten and sent back. Smith eventually went down to DeWitt himself to check it out and realized they didn't have the numbers. They were outnumbered 10-1, and his people were starving. And so he ordered his people in DeWitt to leave and to fall back to far west. The numbers of saints in far west are swelling at this time. In Ray County, so just south of Caldwell, Samuel Bogart was leading a group of about 50 to 60 Missourians who marched up to Caldwell County. Remember, that was the Mormon county that had been set aside as a refuge. But he drove out any Mormons living in Ray County. He burned them out and drove them up to Caldwell. And then he crossed over into Caldwell County and began threatening Mormons there. And he actually took 3 men hostage inside of Caldwell County. And again, exaggerated reports of that reached Smith. And the word Smith got was, he's killed a bunch of people, and he's taken our men, and he's going to kill them in the morning, which wasn't the case. But that's the news Smith got. So Smith was outraged. He gathered a force to rescue them and said, go and kill every devil of them. And they headed out under the command of David Patton, who was a member of the 12, very beloved member of the 12 among the saints. He led a group of Mormons to go and get their people back, which led to what we remember today as the Battle of Crooked River. Bogart was camped out on Crooked River with his men, and at daybreak, Patton's forces attacked their encampment at Crooked River, but the Missourians saw them first as they came over the hill, silhouetted by the light. They saw them first. They fired 2 volleys in which 5 or 6 saints were killed or injured. But before the 3rd volley could be fired, the saints ran through the camp, firing and slashing their way with their swords, screaming, God and liberty. And anyway, the long story short, it was a big victory for the Mormons. They ran off Bogart's forces and they rescued their men in the meantime. Not a big total number of deaths if you're going to count it by, casualties. There was only 1 Missourian and 3 Mormons that were killed in the battle. So the Mormons actually suffered more casualties, but, they won the day and they got their men back. Here's why Crooked River became a huge issue. The problem was the Mormons had attacked an official state militia unit. These weren't just vigilantes. These weren't just mobs. This was an official state militia unit sanctioned by the state. So that made it a big problem for state officials. And again, by the time word got back to Governor Boggs about what had happened, it was vastly exaggerated. What he had heard had actually happened. He heard they're making war on us and they've attacked the state militia and a bunch of people have died. And part of the problem was they had attacked without mercy. Unfortunately for the Mormons, this man, Samuel Tarwater, survived the attack. He was part of Bogart's forces. He had been injured, and as he lay unconscious, they mutilated him pretty severely with their swords, broke out his bottom teeth, broke his jaw, severe slashes on both cheeks, and a gash in his skull big enough to see his brain. And they left him for dead, but unfortunately for them, he survived to press charges. And so by the time all of this gets to Governor Boggs, it's been exaggerated. There was only 4 casualties, but he was told that 10 soldiers had been killed and many more had been wounded, and they'd taken a bunch of prisoners, right? So what he's getting makes it sound far worse than it actually was. And so here's just one of those accounts from a judge in the area. So the attack happened on October 24th. On October 25th, he sent word to the governor saying this: "You have to put a stop to the devastation which is menaced by these infuriated fanatics. Those you send must go prepared and with the full determination to exterminate or expel them from the state en masse. Nothing but this can give tranquility to the public mind and reestablish the supremacy of the laws. The Mormons must leave the state or we will, one and all." That's not the only communication Boggs got like that about the same time. And so Boggs, for the first time, takes decisive action, and probably, looking back, a little too firm in terms of the command that he gave, but he gives official communication 2 days later on October 27th to the state militia to go and take care of the Mormon problem. But his order is very strongly worded. Here's what he said: "I have received information of the most appalling character, which entirely changes the face of things and places the Mormons in the attitude of an open and avowed defiance of the laws, and of having made war upon the people of this state. Your orders are, therefore, to hasten your operation with all possible speed. The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state, if necessary for the public peace. Their outrages are beyond all description." And for obvious reasons, this is remembered today as Governor Boggs' extermination order. That you go get rid of I'm sanctioning you and ordering you to go deal with the saints. Tell them they either go or you can kill them all, and you have my authority to do it. Unfortunately for the saints, before the official state militia could arrive, a group of renegade militiamen resolved to take care of the Mormon issue themselves. And this is such a tragic incident that happened at Hans Mill. The residents of Hans Mill had probably, looking back unwisely, refused to fall back to Far West with the rest of the saints. And it was a new community, cabins, just going up, largely tents, and maybe 60 or 70 residents in Hans Mill. So they, on October 30th of 1838, were just getting up and going about their business early in the morning when they looked up and they saw about 250 troops coming down out of the hills. And they didn't even realize they were under attack. They thought at first it was possibly Mormon reinforcements headed towards Far West. So they didn't even realize the nature of what it was. And these men had been given no orders to assemble. They'd been given no orders to march. They'd been given no orders to attack. This was entirely on their own. But as they approached the little community, they divided into 3 companies. And when David Evans, who was the leader of the community, realized what was going on, he went out and he raised his hands, signaling for peace. And just interesting side note here, David Evans would survive this attack, eventually come to Utah, where he founded the city of Lehi. So that has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, except for it's an interesting side note. He signaled for peace, and at which point Colonel Comstock, who was leading the forces, and I think this must have been a prearranged signal, he fired 1 shot into the air, and then there was 10 seconds of silence, and all 3 of those companies just began to fire into the village. They descended on the camp, ruthlessly killing men and boys wherever they could. Many of the Mormon men and boys tried to take refuge in the blacksmith shop, and when that happens, they just fired indiscriminately through the chinks in the logs. And when they got close enough at one point, once they got down there, they just began, sticking their rifle barrels through the chinks in the logs and firing into these men and boys who were trapped inside. And once the men realized that was happening inside, right, they started trying to run out, and they would just mow them down as they came out. Amanda Smith, who was there that day and survived, she made it into the woods with 2 of her young children. She tried to warn the men in the blacksmith shop when some of the men had been in there having a prayer meeting when the attack began. She tried to warn them, but she didn't make it before the bullets started flying, and she ran into the woods. But her younger son, Alma, who survived, but he had his hip joint blown apart, like literally a hole blown through his hip joint, because a soldier at point blank range put his gun to his hip and pulled the trigger. It wasn't an errant bullet. Her husband, Warren, was killed. Her other son, Sardius, who was 10, was killed, again, when a soldier just put a gun to his head, a 10-year-old, and pulled the trigger. 62-year-old man who was there named Thomas McBride was caught, commanded to surrender his weapon. When he did, the soldier who took his weapon turned it around on him and shot him and killed him with his own weapon. And then they proceeded to mutilate his body from head to foot. Any Mormons found injured were killed in cold blood. And when all the smoke finally cleared that day, about 24 saints had been injured. And of the 38 men and boys in camp, 18 were dead. And again, many more injured, including one non-Mormon who had just been staying there. When the attackers fled, the women and the remaining men, and most of those who survived because they made it into the woods. They came back and buried their dead, and they were afraid the attackers were going to come back at any moment, so they buried them by just sticking them head and foot into a well and throwing some dirt over it. And then after they left, the attackers came back and built a latrine over their makeshift grave and desecrated all of those bodies. So Hans Mill is an ugly, ugly moment, right? On the same day, he got word of the Hans Mill massacre. Smith received word that large mobs were advancing on far west. He promised his followers that they would give these vigilantes a fight no matter how many showed up. He said, God should damn them and we will play hell with their apple cart. And he also assured them that the angels would be fighting on their side. So, war is ugly, right? And we've all seen in the news this week how ugly war can be. In the War of 1838, there was a lot of ugliness going around on both sides. But this was a fight that the saints were not going to win in the end. I'm going to take a break there for this week, and we'll wrap up the Civil War of 1838 next week when we see what happened. So, leaving it off, everybody's pretty much fallen back to far west. All of Smith's forces are there, but Boggs is sending in the militia, and it will lead to the end of the Mormon presence in Missouri. I'll give you this clue, though. It happens without another shot ever being fired. But I think you'll find that story fascinating as well. Next week, it ends up with the saints they end up leaving Missouri. We'll find out where they head next. But it's a long story to get them there. So we'll pick up there next week. All right? Thanks for being here today. Let me pray for us, and I'll answer any questions you might have.